All right, guys, we've got our MK8 GTI back, and Garrett sent us a turbo to upgrade with. So we're gonna be going through the install process of this. This particular turbo is a direct bolt-on and doesn't require any oddities like different oil lines or weird fitments. It's a direct swap. So we'll be taking you through the process. We've got the turbo, the install kit that Unitronic is sourcing, and our liquid moly oil change kit. So let's get started and we'll show you how this goes. All right, guys, to give you a better field of view of what we're doing and kind of make it easier to see, have more light, we're gonna start by removing our hood and setting it aside. This is not something that's needed to do during this process, so don't fret that. But we will be doing it for your viewing pleasure. Now that we've got the hood out of the way, we are going to begin by getting the turbo exposed. It's going to include removing the intake, the engine cover. We've got some components on top of the engine that we'll take off. And then we'll go under the car and get everything down there loosened up so that we can continue with removal of this turbo. So we've got to get all of this wiring harness out of the way, which will free up a lot of space for us and make everything a lot more visible. Once we have the wiring harness out of the way, we'll start moving everything that we need to be able to have the space that we need for this turbo to come out through the top. Ultimately, the plan is to remove the components here so that this turbo can come out this way without needing to remove too much. And we'll actually disconnect the engine from the lower subframe mount, and I don't know if we'll be able to get a whole lot of rocking because of the engine and transmission mounts that we have, which are BFI stage 3. So they're basically solid, which may cause us or need us to get creative to get this thing rocking. But should be pretty straightforward and simple, and we're well on our way. These clips on the exhaust camshaft actuators that sit behind the coil packs, they are fairly fragile, and they've got a locking clip that has to be disengaged for them to unclip from the from the actuators. So best bet is to get the coil packs disconnect from the harness and get as much free movement as you can. There is a little retainer here on this evap line, and we'll disconnect it so that we can move the harness even more. And that will make it so that we can get to the locking tabs on those connectors. So you'll see under here, these little red tabs, they've got to come up, and you want to be gentle and not break anything, but they will pop up, and then you'll be able to disengage the clip. So we've got all of these exhaust cam actuators out of the way. Here is our upstream O2 sensor. And this is for our blow-off valve solenoid. And it's got another one of these clips. Now we've got our exhaust cam position sensor, our high pressure fuel pump, and now we've got everything out of the way up this far. Now, on this side, we do have a couple oil pressure switches and sensors, and those will get disconnected. They can be a little tricky to get to, but may use a pick. Go. App sensor. These can be a little tricky to pop off, but the right amount of leverage in the right places makes it easy. And we don't even have to go that far. We just want this out of our way. So that will work. Now with everything back here exposed, we're ultimately going to want to get some more of these components out of the way. This coolant line we will fully remove from the vehicle. This line will tuck out of the way, and then we'll continue with removing components for the turbo. However, at this time, to save us from a bigger mess than we need to create, we're gonna get the car in the air, drain the oil and the coolant. Since we're disconnecting coolant lines, we will need to at least add coolant, so it's a good time to flush the system. Additionally, whenever you're swapping a turbo, or really in my opinion, doing anything that has to do with the oiling system of your car. So if your engine has a component and that component is provided oil from the system, I would always recommend doing an oil change just to prevent any contamination from getting in there and either causing potential harm to the new component that you're putting in or causing harm to your engine. Oh. Oil and coolant have been drained, and we are picking up where we left off up top. We've got to get this coolant line out of the way. We're going to get the coolant line for the turbo disconnected and out of the way. And then we'll keep pulling parts off progressively and get this little turbo exposed, and then get the big turbo in. Coolant line is out of the way. Now we'll get the battery and battery tray out of the way, disconnect our charge pipe, and remove the elbow so we have the turbo freed up from that. Well, now that charge pipe elbow is off and we've got other things freed up, we're gonna get the turbo inlet and the turbo outlet flange out and then remove our blow-off valve. While we do that, we'll also take the liberty to get it cleaned up and refreshed, just so that if there's any buildup or anything that has accumulated, we'll be able to get that removed. And next will be the inlet pipe. Now we've got this PCV hose and we will want to remove it. To get that out of the way, we can probably do it without removing the coils on this car. So we'll move forward with that, but it may be easier for you to remove the number 3 and 4 coil to get that out of the way. Then on the back side of this PCV line, there are 2 tabs that will attach it to the actual oil separator. And if you pinch the top and bottom, you can get it to disconnect. However, it may, again, be difficult with both coils in place, but it should be doable. We should be able to get away with just removing the first 4 of these. I typically will remove all of them to give myself more room and make things look less cluttered. Just note that you don't have to take them all out. It's just for my peace of mind. Now, these actuators, they can be a little tricky to get out, and what I like to do is get them rotating first. So a little pressure on them and they'll start to spin, and then you can get it up, and you want to hold on to it so it doesn't shoot out of there, but a little bit of pressure and it'll pop free. Now, they've got an O-ring, so just make sure that that's not super dirty and doesn't get damaged, and you don't want any pressure on the shaft as you're pulling it out. Now these are essentially all the same, but as with anything, I would recommend labeling them for their number. This is the last one, number 8. That way when you put them back in, they go back in the same bore that they came out of. So I've got to get this coolant line out of the way. All right, so we've got a large amount of these components removed at this point, and we are continuing on here. So I'm in the process of removing our oil feed line. Can't take the oil line off until I get the heat shield out. So I'm gonna move to working on the downpipe. So we're gonna try to do all this without fully removing the downpipe, which shouldn't be necessary. It does make it a lot easier because you get a lot more space out of it. But removing the OEM downpipe is quite a bit more involved, and really, with needing to drop the subframe down a little bit to be able to get it out, would negate the principle of doing it from the top to begin with. So, got our V-band loosened up here, and push it over onto the turbo. So that's off the downpipe entirely. And on these particular units, they use one 13mm bolt that secures the downpipe to the block. I think I may be able to reach it from here. However, I'm not entirely sure. All right, so on the back side of the block here, we've got one 13mm bolt that is gonna hold the downpipe to the block. Now, this doesn't have to come out, it just has to be loosened. And depending on the angle and the tool that you're using, you may need to sneak in there with a wrench or an extension of some sort, because it is a little bit tight with the axle heat shield. But I think with the right combination here, we should get it with relative ease. Hey, look, not have to fight it too much, but this guy loose, we'll be able to move the downpipe up and out of the way. I'm also going to disconnect the downpipe bracket from the subframe, because that will allow it to drop just that much more and give us room to work around the turbo. So the secondary O2 sensor clips onto this bracket and it'll pop right off. This actually hooks into the back side of it, so pry that forward and it will pop right off. The thing with the downpipe more or less is freed up now, and it's just a friction fit ultimately on the turbo. So a little bit of love and it should come off, but it is acting pretty tight right now. So there it goes. So now with the downpipe moved to the side, we have access to be able to get the fasteners that hold this heat shield on in the back of the engine, and then we can remove this 1.5mm that will free it up the rest of the way. That'll give us access to get this coolant feed line out of the way and this oil feed line removed, and then we'll be able to move to the back side where the coolant return and the bottom side where the oil return line reside. Get those loosened up and taken off the turbo, then it'll be time to yank this guy out. So I know that a lot of what I've been doing here we've kind of talked about, and you see me doing it, but you don't really see what it is that I'm doing, because everything is tucked away in these hard to reach behind everything places. As much as I wish I could go over this in more detail and show you everything with an elevated level of clarity, it's very difficult to do with a full camera. What we're going to try to do here in the future is we'd like to go over this process on an engine that isn't installed in a car, so that we can show you every step and every part that is involved and allow you to see what we're doing in its entirety. So please accept our apologies for the lack of visual reference here. There are two 10mm bolts that sit on the passenger side of this heat shield, and then there will be one more that sits directly behind where the downpipe connects to the turbo. Now, I urge you to use a large amount of care when you're dealing with this heat shield. They are extremely sharp, razor sharp, especially when they start to separate. So they have put these retainers on top of the nuts that hold the turbo on, and I would imagine That is simply to keep them in their position and keep them from loosening. But it's interesting. It's definitely odd. So we'll see how that goes when we've got to put them back on. But the next part of what we've got to do here is get this coolant line off, this oil line off, and then we've got two more to get, one on the back and one on the bottom. The one on the back, Volkswagen's made a pretty significant change in the actual line, which should make it a lot easier to get off. All right, so I'm gonna start with coolant feed line. Now, these are M8 triple squares that hold the coolant lines in. Oh my God. I'm in love with this coolant return line. I'm in love with it. Look at this. Watch, watch, watch. So this is that bracket that's attached to the coolant return line. And with just a little bit of love, she comes right off. Now with this coolant feed line, we want to do something similar with how we got the actuators for the exhaust cam out. We want to rotate it, and by rotating it, it should free up the O-ring inside, allowing us to get it out of the way. There we go. So you'll see, this is what will begin to happen. You'll get this buildup of rust and debris that causes this to get seized in there. And that's what we would encounter on the backside, making it very difficult to get out, but not anymore. Now, with any luck, this will come up without fighting us too much, even though we can't rotate our engine. So here, start the rotation of the turbo, and there it goes. Just like that, guys, it comes out pretty easily. I'm surprised about that. So here we've got our OEM MK8 GTI's turbocharger. Although it's produced by Garrett, this Garrett turbocharger is substantially larger. It also has some features that are designed to be better suited for power. So on this unit, we typically use a turbo muffler. And then on a lot of the mods that we do, we use what's called a turbo muffler delete. It essentially removes the turbulent builder in the airflow. The idea being that the OEM part quiets the air flowing through it so you don't hear turbo noises, and the parts that we put in let you hear it, because us car guys like to hear that stuff. So this is what we use here. This being a single part, there's no point of failure or O-ring that could leak under high boost levels. It also makes it a really simple installation because you don't have to deal with trying to fit anything into a tight space. It's already there and takes up less space on its own. They share a lot of similarities as far as mounting location goes, and really size altogether. The differences are primarily going to be in compressor wheel and turbine wheel sizes, as well as the housings. So on the factory turbo, you'll notice here that the turbine housing is fairly dainty. And on the new turbo, it's a much more robust unit. And Garrett's actually taken it upon themselves to market with the AR ratio, which this one is a 0.64 AR. I'm not sure what the OEM one is because it is not labeled. However, it's notably smaller. So this should be able to flow those hot exhaust gases much better than this turbo does. That ultimately resulting in potential for more power. We've got some shots of the turbos for you to take a look at the compressor and turbine wheels, but the turbine wheel on this new turbo is substantially larger. The compressor wheels are a little bit different. This guy has six blades. This guy has 8 blades. I don't think you'll see too much of a difference between blade count, but size is going to be a huge factor. And with this having a larger intake compressor housing, as well as the larger wheel, it'll be able to suck and push more air in, resulting in a lot more potential power. So we are excited to get this in and see how it does, and really have high hopes for what it can do for our car, and we're really excited to see what software options are able to take advantage of it the best. So I just found something kind of neat. As we did mention, we have the AR ratio on the new turbocharger's turbine housing. I was just looking at the compressor housings though, and they are both marked. Now, I do suspect that there's a pretty big difference between these two turbine housings, but the numbers for the new compressor housing are pretty far apart. On the new one, we've got a 0.7 AR, and on the old one, it's at a 0.46. So, well, we've nearly doubled the area from what I can gather here, and that is pretty exciting. So now that we have the stock turbo out, we've got to work on getting this guy in. There's a couple things that we'll need to do ahead of time. We've got to go in and take out the old turbocharger head gasket, and we've got to replace all of the O-rings that go to the lines to this turbo. Some people may say that this isn't mandatory. However, for the amount of work that it takes to get to these things, it's a no-brainer to replace a couple of O-rings along the way. You'll also always want to put a new downpipe gasket in with the new turbo. Pulling out the old one will result in it crumbling basically and not providing a seal, resulting in an exhaust leak in the engine bay. Not the best thing. So we will go ahead and get started with swapping out the O-rings. We can start with the coolant feed line that goes to the turbocharger that we'll be putting on after we get it in. So I just want to use a pick or a seal puller tool and pop the old one off. You'll see that on these there tend to be a good amount of buildup that can really cause some debris issues. On the actual fitting inside of the lands, there is the same debris and contamination that was on the O-ring. So make sure to clean these up. Use a piece of Scotch-Brite, get in that groove, get all the dirt and rust or debris out, and then when you put it back fresh, everything will go together a lot nicer, and in the future, if you need to take it apart again, it'll come apart a lot easier too. All right, so we'll slide this guy on, and that's good to go. This one will go into the turbo after it's installed. And now I'm gonna go into the car and swap out the ones that are on the lines that go into the turbo. So we'll start with our oil feed line here. This is gonna be the little one. And the oil return line, which will be the green one. And the coolant return line, which will be the same as the coolant feed line. So the little one goes on our coolant or our oil feed. The green one goes on our oil return. And the black one goes onto the coolant return line. Now with all these replaced, we just have to put the new gasket in. Now, much like the heat shield, these are dangerous. So when you're taking them off, use a lot of care because they will cut you. Now that we've got the new O-rings on the lines, the turbocharger gasket replaced, we're ready to get the turbo put in its place. A couple things to note: you need to keep certain lines in certain places. This one needs to stay on top in front of the turbo and not get stuck underneath or behind it. This one, you want it to fall down when you're putting the turbo in, because it will have to go down and up underneath the wastegate arm. And then this one can just hang out back here. As long as it's not getting hit or anything, everything should be fine. Do take note of where these lines are when the turbo is going in, because you don't want them to get crushed, or these brand new O-rings that you put in to get hit by a sharp part on the turbo, which may cause them to leak. So just go slow and be patient. Sometimes it's a little challenging to wiggle it in, but we're gonna find out how this big turbo fits in this car. So much like when we took it out, we're gonna try to get an orientation that fits well. We know the turbo has to go in like this, so actually sweeping it in like that would be preferable, but we'll have to find out where we've got adequate space for it. And we've adequate space. So our oil feed line is out of the way. The oil return line is currently to the left of the turbo, well, my left. And that's really where we want it, because as we wiggle this into place, we can grab that return line and move it in front of the wastegate arm, which is actually up and out of the way on this turbo too. So it shouldn't be a challenge, even nearly as much as the OEM one was. All right, so this doesn't have to be tight right away, but you just want it to be held in place. We can double check all of our items here. We've got our oil return line that has already found its hole and it's sitting in there. Don't press it in all the way quite yet, because we still have to get the retaining screw into it, and that can be challenging if it's really tight. The coolant return line can also be a bit of a challenge to deal with if it's hooked up before you get that bolt in. So we'll get the nuts tightened up to get the turbo in its final place. Then we will get that bolt that retains the oil return line in, and then everything else will just be a breeze. And we should just be able to have it snap back together the same way that it came apart, and show you what that looks like. All right, so The two nuts on the bottom of the turbo are really easy to get to with the downpipe out, but I wanted to demonstrate how to do this most like a lot of you DIYers would do it in your driveway on jack stands. And in doing so, taking the downpipe out isn't really a feasible option. With our particular setup, it's a little bit different because we've got a tubular subframe that gives us more room, and we already have an aftermarket downpipe in the car. However, this is the most similar situation that I can represent. Now, from the top, I can access those nuts with a wrench, but it's very little movement, very slow pace, and pretty challenging to access with the downpipe there. But from the bottom, it's a much more straight shot. So laying on your back, getting at this angle is very easy under the car. So we're gonna go ahead and get these tightened up and then finish tightening them to spec up top. But this is what we'll do. And then we'll also get the oil return line fastened to the turbo while we're down here. All right, kids, so this screw that holds in the oil return line on the bottom of the turbo can be a real challenge to get in. From the top, it is doable, but it's hard. There's very little articulation available. And from the bottom, even with the factory subframe, there is a hole that lines up so you can get a straight view directly underneath where this fastener goes. And so you'll position yourself and look at the bottom of the turbo, and you'll see where that line is connected. And ultimately, we'll just try to find the straightest path up and slowly walk our tool up there. And as it gets right there, we'll need to get up there. But you can pull it into place. And it should start to thread in. Now, my oil line is in its place and it is in the hole. It's not fully seated, so we'll take it slow and make sure that it does get a nice seat. So we're gonna go ahead and get the coolant feed line popped in here. And it's a little snug, but it won't be too difficult. If it is fighting you, check your bore and the line because it may have some debris on it. This should wiggle around a little bit until you find your threads, which will be there. You may need to rotate the line just a tad to be able to get them to line up. But once they do, and you're able to get the first couple threads on there, it will easily thread the rest of the way in. And then you'll just want to tighten that down with an M8 triple square. And now we will address our coolant return line, which is on the back of the turbo. And it should just sit in that hole without too much fuss. And then once it is, another M8 triple square will hold that guy in. Over tighten them, but make sure they are snug. Now, before we connect our oil feed line, we're going to manually fill the turbo with oil so that it's got a head start. We still will prime the engine prior to first start, but this gives it a little bit of a leg up. I don't want to tighten this down yet because it is obstructing this hole, especially with the coolant line and everything in there. So we'll get it put in its place for the most part here, and it should fit without any trouble and line right up. But before we snap that in, we will get these actuators in place. All right, so we've got everything back together for the most part. We still have to get the intake and the battery box in. But before we do that, we'll go ahead and get the fluids filled. We've got to add coolant, and we've got to fill the engine oil. We've got the new filter in already. So we'll start by filling the system with a gravity fill and then get it topped off with the vacuum filler. And as far as the oil goes, let's fill it up and she's good to go. All right, so the oil has been filled, coolant has been filled with a vacuum fill tool, making sure that all of the crevices of the cooling system have been filled with coolant and the air replaced. Everything else is good to go and ready to get buttoned up. So next step is get the battery tray in, then we can get the battery and intake in, and we will be just about done. It sounds really good. You hear the turbo? The turbo sounds sick. All right, guys, that wraps up the install of this Garrett turbocharger on our MK8 GTI. We're gonna get the software flashed as we head over to the dyno for our next test with it, but that will be in a short while because we've got some pretty exciting things coming up. Really, as you can see, this is a straightforward, simple install process of this turbo, much like a direct swap turbo would be. There were a couple things that we encountered that some of you may experience if you've got the same hardware changes that we have on our car. One of those being the APR charge pipes. They come with a updated turbo muffler delete with a larger outlet size, and the coupler is larger as well. So it wouldn't fit on the Garrett turbo directly. What we had to do was use a portion of the OEM hose and treat it as a coupler or extension or spacer, if you will, between the APR silicone coupler and the outlet of the Garrett turbocharger. It creates a good seal, everything's good and happy there, but it is something that we had to do to make these parts work together. The other thing that we found is that with our forged blow-off valve, the last exhaust camshaft actuator plug will not connect to the actuator itself with the blow-off valve fully installed. I had to remove the fasteners for the blow-off valve and lift the blow-off valve and lower it down and plug in the connector at the same time to be able to make everything fit properly. But with it all together, it's tight, but it fits there just fine. One other thing that I have noted, and I'm going to need to touch base with Garrett to determine if this is kind of a one-off thing that we've experienced or if it's normal. So the PCV hose that goes from the turbocharger to the oil separator, it did not want to reach. It was very, very tight. I had to stretch and twist it a little bit to be able to make it reach the PCV plate from the turbo. And in doing so, it's caused a little bit of deformation. There's no damage to the pipe, but it isn't exactly ideal. So I'm not sure if we'll have a solution for that coming up. We've got a couple ideas of things to try and test that should be a solid solution for that. But otherwise, everything went really flawlessly. And it's actually nice because this turbo gives you even more room around it to work than the OEM one does. So technically it's easier installing one of these than it is an OEM turbo. But we're excited to get it tested out, see how this thing performs. And I have very good expectations for the sound it'll make under load, considering that on first start, you can definitely hear the turbo and it sounds good. So we'll be sure to bring you some footage of it making some power, and we'll see what this baby can do. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you guys have any questions, leave us a note down in the comments, and like and subscribe for more.